I call the member for Bradfield.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise to speak on the Broadcasting Legislation Amendment Convergence Review and Other Measures Bill and the Television Licence Fees Amendment Bill. Mr Deputy Speaker, as you're well aware, these two bills form part of the rushed package of so-called media reforms being pursued by the Minister for Broadband Communications and the Digital Economy. And although the Minister has told us that he would not negotiate on the terms of his package, in fact what we are now doing is debating two of those 6 bills, principally on the basis that they are what might be described as perhaps the less egregious part of a package which is overall very much an egregious, offensive and indefensible complex of measures. These two bills form a reasonably sensible but far from perfect part of the overall package. What we've seen in what's been introduced by the Minister in a furious rush since last Tuesday, when it first saw the light of public scrutiny, is a package which is deeply flawed in substance and which is just as deeply flawed in process. And it is no surprise that members of this House, both on this side and on the crossbenches, have spoken out very strongly about how flawed the process is. And even more importantly, perhaps, industry participants across almost the entire industry, the entire broadcasting and media industry, have highlighted this extremely flawed process. Mr Deputy Speaker, the particular two bills that the Parliament is debating this afternoon are, as I say, the relatively more sensible part of this package. Nevertheless, they still stand out as dealing with at least two areas where we have seen grossly incompetent behaviour from this minister. The first, of course, is the licence fee reduction, the reduction in licence fees paid by television broadcasters, an episode which first was seen in 2010, and we're now seeing a repeat of that. And secondly, the botched process for allocating the right to be Australia's international broadcaster. Both of these inglorious episodes of public policy are dealt with in this bill, and in essence it seems what the minister is trying to do is cover over some of his past mistakes. In the brief time I have today, therefore, I want to make just 3 points in relation to the bills that the House is considering this afternoon. First, I want to expand on the proposition that, as a public policy process, what we've seen has been utterly shambolic, completely contemptuous of the Parliament and of the Australian people, and of in particular, the thousands of people who work in the media and communications sector, whose the future of whose companies depends upon the rules being made here. Secondly, I want to make the point that the approach taken in these bills in relation to the reduction in television broadcasting licence fees is better than the approach taken by the minister in 2010, but still raises some significant questions which there has not been time to properly consider. And thirdly, I want to make the point that the proposed new section or clause 31AAA, which would have the effect, if it passed into law, that only the ABC would be permitted to provide Australia's international broadcasting service, is a fundamentally bad piece of policy which we on this side of the chamber object to. Let me start with the proposition that, as a public policy process, what we've seen here from the Minister for Broadband Communications and the Digital Economy in relation to his so-called media reforms has been absolutely horrible. Supposedly, what we are considering before the Parliament this afternoon is a package developed in response to the Convergence review conducted in 2011 and the Finkelstein inquiry into media regulation conducted in 2012. Yet, despite the fact that it's been nearly 2 years since the Convergence review reported, the actual detailed statutory provisions that were proposed to be implemented, that were proposed to be passed by the Parliament, only saw the light of public visibility last week. And yet, ludicrously, the minister is proposing that the Parliament should pass this entire package of 6 bills by the end of this week. Not just the House of Representatives, but the Senate as well. It is an indefensible proposition to seek to argue that this is in any way a sensible, a respectable and appropriate public policy process. It plainly is not. It is the very opposite of what one would hope to see, which is a measured and steady process of public policy development, critically a process which includes extensive consultation with stakeholders. That is what one would expect to see. That is the very opposite of what we are seeing. The minister has said several times over the last week and a bit that it's been known for a couple of years that he was wanting to make major reforms in this area. That is no answer to the criticism that this has been a truly horrible public process, because a knowledge of a generalised desire on the part of the minister to make changes is one thing. The chance to read, analyse and respond to the detailed statutory provisions is quite the opposite. And what the minister is proposing is that the parliament, as well as the affected industries, should have only a few short days to consider many, many pages of detailed legislative provisions, provisions which are central to the very operation of major industries, the television industry, the newspaper industry and other associated industries, industries which employ thousands of people and industries which provide news and entertainment and information and other services to millions of Australians. It is a scandalous and indefensible proposition that this is in any way a process which is appropriate or can be justified. Indeed, not only has the minister treated the parliament with contempt, it seems he's even been prepared to treat his cabinet colleagues with contempt, because a package of this scale and complexity was considered by Cabinet without the papers even being available before the Cabinet meeting commenced, and with no coordinating comments from other departments, it is reliably reported. What a scandalous way to deal with an important area of public policy. The minister has sought to impose a ludicrous deadline that the entire package should be considered and voted on by both chambers of the parliament by this Thursday. It is really almost indescribable what an abomination of a public policy process this is. And it is no surprise, therefore, that leading figures in the affected industries have been very, very critical of the process. As Mr Kerry Stokes, chairman of 7 West Media, said, "I can only recall legislation being pushed in this haste in the wake of 9/11. My submission is you shouldn't be doing any of this." And as the CEO of Fairfax Media, Greg Highwood, said, "To be plain, the impression voiced almost universally over the weekend is that the process is at least unseemingly rushed and the bills mirror that state of affairs." Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, I want to make the point that in criticising the process I am not making a partisan comment. I am making a comment about public administration, and the best piece of evidence I can offer to demonstrate that this is not a partisan comment is to look at what happened when then Minister for Transport and Communications Kim Beazley introduced the Broadcasting Services Act in 1991 and 1992. And I have no hesitation in saying that Kim Beazley can properly be regarded as one of the giants of the communications sector in Australia. And when you look back at the history of the way he dealt with the Broadcasting Services Act, what you see is an exemplary process, a process that is very different to the one being conducted by the present minister, who could more appropriately be described as one of the pygmies of the communications sector. On the 7th of November 1991, the then Minister for Transport and Communications gave a statement on the exposure draft of the Broadcasting Services Bill. And I emphasise on the exposure draft. So he was putting out a detailed draft of the legislative provisions. And he had this to say, as I quote, "As I mentioned earlier, the bill is not the government's final position on the new legislation, but an exposure draft intended to facilitate community consideration of the issues. A widespread process of consultation will be undertaken over the next 3 months on several fronts. I intend to make myself available," this is the minister, I intend to make myself available to speak at a number of major conferences on issues arising out of the review of broadcasting and to receive the views of any interested parties who want to make a submission." And he goes on to say senior departmental officials will be available. His department has established a process to receive requests for the relevant documents, and the caucus subcommittee will be initiating widespread community consultation. That, Mr Deputy Speaker, is a good process of consultation. What we have seen in relation to the package of bills being put forward by the present minister is an appalling process. Let me turn to the second issue I want to raise in the brief time available, which is the question of the reduction in licence fees for commercial television broadcasters, which is part of this package. Mr Deputy Speaker, the level of licence fees is always a contentious issue. Understandably enough, the television broadcasters would like the licence fees to be as low as possible. On the other hand, the Parliament of Australia must be conscious that the government has, through the Parliament and through the agencies of government, granted the television broadcasters a scarce and valuable right, which is to use spectrum, a limited public resource, and to grant them, in effect, the right to participate in an oligopoly protected by statute. That is a very valuable economic privilege. It will be pointed out, no doubt, by the television industry that it's less valuable than it once was, given the well-understood difficulties their businesses are facing with competition from the internet, but it remains a valuable economic privilege granted by the Parliament on behalf of the people of Australia. And the Parliament has seen fit over the years to extract from the broadcasters in return certain commitments, particularly commitments to carry Australian content. Those are very important commitments, and people have for many years made the point about the cultural and national identity significance of Australian television carrying many hours of Australian programming. At the same time, as we all know, it costs more to produce an hour of Australian television programming than it costs to buy an hour of American or other foreign programming. So you have some conflicting principles at work here. The key point to make in this debate is that what the minister has done in this legislation is proposed to entrench permanently a material reduction in the broadcasting licence fees. And this is an area where the minister has form, because in 2010, with very little notice, he granted the industry a substantial reduction in fees, a 33% reduction in 2010 and a 50% reduction in 2011. It totalled over $200 million across all of the licensees, and yet the minister did not bother to get any commitments in return. You would have thought that an obvious commitment to obtain would be one in relation to increases in Australian content, so some demonstration that in exchange for the significant economic relief the broadcasters were receiving, there were some additional public policy benefits. Now, the question for present purposes is whether the benefit the minister purports to have obtained on this occasion is sufficient to justify the substantial reduction in licence fees which is being offered as part of this legislation. And it is hard to avoid the conclusion that because of the haste with which this package is being rammed through, it is difficult to make an informed assessment of that important public policy question. Let me turn thirdly to the question of proposed section 31AAA, which would have the effect that only the ABC would be permitted to provide Australia's international broadcasting service. Now, this is another example of the minister using this bill to attempt to backfill over the gaping holes left by his woefully incompetent carriage of public policy in this area, and particularly in this case the flawed process by which the right to provide Australia's international broadcasting service, and of course to receive substantial payment from the Australian government for doing so, was to be allocated through a competitive process. Not once but twice that process led to the relevant officials recommending that Sky should be chosen to carry out that task, and not once but twice this government interfered to say, no, no, we want the ABC to do it. Now it seems they want to entrench that in legislation. There can be no good basis for doing so, and all you are doing is removing competitive tension next time you come to have a tender. So this is the less flawed part of a terribly flawed package, but it still has plenty of flaws.